Good morning to everyone. It is June the 5th, and we're into governance. Just as a note, I revised the grades upward and published them. So that should be done. So without further ado, let me go to the article. This was an article that I had posted. Now, why did I post it? I posted it because I thought that polycentric governance was just one picture of governance. And I was worried that we would go through this course, 531, with one picture of governance. Governance, as I've mentioned in other reflections, is an enormous issue. It's difficult to describe how pivotal it is. So having only one picture of it, I thought, was leaving us with too little. So I had selected this article entitled Community Development as Prefigurative, which is an interesting term, Radically Democratic Global Governance. So let me read the title again. It's a pretty ambitious one. Community Development is Prefigurative, Radically Democratic Global Governance. And it's a question, right? So these authors are out of the School of Public Administration. And another reason, by the way, that I selected this particular article is that it deals quite clearly with an approach to, and it declares this, it comes right out and says, this is an approach to radical community development. Now, by radical, let's define that term because it's such an explosive term, and it should not be. The term radical is from the Latin word radix, which means root. So to have a radical approach is to have an approach that goes to the root cause of a specific problem or set of problems. And that's how I'm using the term here. So when I say a radical approach, when these authors say a radical approach, they're not talking about Molotov cocktails and riots. They're talking about an analytical approach that goes deep, that seeks to get underneath the surface to the root cause of a problem, right? So it's in that sense that this approach, integrative governance, is an approach to radical community development. So unlike polycentric governance, in the case of principles, where we have what is, for the most part, a management approach, and again, that's not a critique of it, it's just to put it in its proper place. So it is more in line, that approach, polycentric governance, is more in line with a reformist agenda, right? There's nothing inside that picture of governance to suggest that it's radical in the way this approach is. And you can see this, not difficult to see, in that this approach, integrative governance, has explicit social, political, and economic goals. It seeks greater social, economic, and political justice. So in that sense as well, this approach is a radical approach. So it's not accepting the status quo and somehow managing within it. It seeks to revise the status quo itself. Now, before going into this, and I will not be long today, I promise, but I thought this was an important view, at least an alternative view, and I think an important one. First of all, keep in mind, it's more in line with critical social theory than polycentric governance, right? So if only for that reason, it merits our attention. Now, let me go into a technicality in the text itself. They talk about ideal types near the beginning. And I wanted to explain that term just a little bit. An ideal type is a model. And I will go back to my favorite example of this, the planetary system. When we look at the planetary system with the sun in the middle and, you know, the planets revolving around the sun, we're looking at a model. In other words, we're looking at an abstract simplification of reality. And to be honest with you, we don't have to go into the philosophy of science here, but if you have a model or a theory, that is what you have. You have a kind of ideal type. You know, our conceptualizations, our theories will only get so close to reality, and reality will always outrun our theories. That is to say, reality is richer than our cognitive abilities, right? We can think and think and think and still not get to the heart of the matter. Because the heart of the matter, which is embedded in this thing we call reality, is well beyond our cognitive control. So my point about ideal types, the phrase comes from Weber. Weber was one of the pioneers of modern sociology. In fact, I think you could call him the pioneer of modern sociology. There were a few predecessors like Auguste Comte, but for the most part, Weber is considered the father of modern sociology. And the term ideal type comes from Weber. So an ideal type, just to simplify it, an ideal type is just that. It's a model of reality that subtracts a lot of the complexity in order to design a picture of reality that can be tested against it, right? And again, this is not an extraordinary characteristic of this approach. Every science that promulgates a theory, that puts out a theory, is engaging in an ideal type. So that's all this means here. When they talk about ideal types, they're talking about that kind of simplification. In fact, the term they use, and it's a nice term, ideal types can be seen as caricatured simplifications. In other words, the theorist knows he or she is simplifying to the point of simplification. But without such simplification, it's impossible to state a theory, right? A theory is always general in nature. It always extends beyond the reality it seeks to explain. So that's just a note on ideal types. Now, what I wanted to say is I think their discussion of the farmer-to-farmer movement is intended to provide empirical support for the ideal type that they describe under the heading of integrative governance, right? So integrative governance is itself an ideal type, and they're looking to the farmer-to-farmer movement. They're studying it. They're examining its components and the pieces of it, and they're attempting to argue that this empirical description of the farmer-to-farmer movement somehow illustrates the model and substantiates the model. That, I think, is the general thesis of the reading. So in other words, they want to be able to present a model of integrative governance, turn to the farmer-to-farmer movement, and use it as an extensive empirical illustration of the ideal type, of the model, of the model of integrative governance. So that's where they're taking this. The case study on the farmers, this is a case study. So they're looking at a particular case, and they're attempting to derive various, or to substantiate, I should say, various principles. Now, also on context, note that this is a direct response to the neoliberal assault on agriculture. Now, I would hope I don't have to go into that here. I suspect you're all familiar with it. That's why I said what I just said. I don't want to go through details that are already familiar to you. To make a long story short, we see agribusiness attempting around the world, by the way, attempting to replace local seeds, buy up local seeds, take control of farming lands. This is going on around the world. This might be described as a land grab by the plutocracy, right? I mean, that's one way to put it. In other words, those who control agribusiness, and they're capitalists, they're owners of the means of production. So that's an appropriate term for them, classically understood. They own the means of production, they own capital, hence they're capitalists. These capitalists, under the banner of agribusiness, have fought a pretty long war against local farmers around the globe. So this is the context, the broader context of integrated governance. Now, in looking at the farmer-to-farmer movement, they talk about agroecology in opposition to neoliberal conceptions of agriculture, where agriculture is seen more or less as a massive conveyor belt, right? So you just drive seeds in, you cultivate them, you harvest them, and this becomes almost mechanical in nature. The production is mass production, right? So it's economies of scale, efficiencies, all of those criteria of agribusiness tend to be imposed wherever you see agribusiness. So we have a tension here between the agribusiness sector, which is attempting to take control of agriculture around the world, and we have, on the other hand, agroecology and small farmers and networks. Indeed, as we see in this article, global networks of farmers who are organizing in order to resist agribusiness. So it's in this context, it's a context of transformation. It's a context appropriate to critical social theory, rather unlike polycentric governance in the principles for building resilience. It's not at all clear that approach has this broader sense of transformation, of resistance, of democratic control, although we do see elements of democratic governance in the literature in principles on polycentric governance. So what we have here then is a tension between a reformist governance and a transformative governance. So this is what I would ask you to keep in mind as you go through this article. The other thing I would ask you to keep in mind, or rather to pose as a question to yourself, is how does this approach compare and contrast with the approach in principles? So what is the relationship between integrative governance, as described here, and polycentric governance, as described in principles? I think you might find there's some interesting comparisons and contrasts in these two models. This model, I mean, one simple difference, I think, is that this model has global implications. So this is an international model of governance. It's not clear that the polycentric governance had that kind of scope, although perhaps it could be extended to have that scope. I don't mean to suggest it's impossible for polycentric governance to have an international dimension. In fact, the model seems pretty suited to it. So we have here in this article, and I'm just going to run through them rather quickly, various elements of that they identify of integrative governance. So one thing I wanted to point out is that the governance here is steeped in a pedagogy, which, by the way, is not true of polycentric governance. Now, when I say it's steeped in a pedagogy, what I mean is there's a pedagogical notion that informs integrative governance. And that pedagogical notion is praxis, what they call praxis-based pedagogy. So this is about using praxis, which is doing. It's practice, but it's not practice in the English sense of the term. It's more like doing. So if you're doing, you're in the world of praxis. And if you're reflecting on doing, you're reflecting on praxis. And reflection on praxis has a very, very long history in Western thought. So it's interesting to see here that it's coming up, this idea of practice, of praxis, of doing as a source of education, right? So that's an important general principle, I think, that stands behind integrative governance. Now, other principles, they talk about co-creationism, and I wanted to make a note about this because I find it so peculiar what they say. They talk about co-creationism, they give a religious interpretation of it. That's not common, in my opinion. When we talk about co-creation, what we are usually talking about is a group of people coming together to create X or Y. And co-creation is bringing all of the participants, regardless of their status or level, into the process of creation. So there's a literature on this, on co-creation. It's often, by the way, considered a principle of transformation. So if you look at the literature on transformational change, you will tend to see a strong emphasis on co-creation. So co-creation is, of course, consistent with participative management or participative leadership. So there's an awful lot that can be said there. There's pretty rich literature on it. Another principle they discuss is stewardship, which they tend to define as mutual care, responsibility, and what they call answerability. I would change that word to accountability. That's just the more common expression. Accountability is answerability. There's a distinction between responsibility and accountability. You can be responsible for X and not be accountable for it. It's quite possible. So if you need to hear about that distinction further, let me know. I've lived it. So also a third principle is what they call radical democracy. And they describe this as the transition from power over others to power with others. You can see how consistent this is with co-creation, because co-creation involves the sharing of power, of creative power. So stewardship is part of this. We've seen stewardship in principles, of course. It's surprising to me that in principles, they don't talk about stewardship at great length, but it's there. It is there throughout. So what they say about radical democracy is, I think, important. They talk about a consensus building model. Now, consensus, just to go to that term, consensus is core to the vocabulary of governance. Why? Consensus building is a form of decision making, right? And I said in other reflections, when we talk about governance, at the end of the day, when push comes to shove, what are we talking about? Decision making. So this radical democracy, that principle of integrative governance, issues in an approach to decision making that is consensus based. And just to be clear on what consensus is, consensus, we might say, is general agreement, but as general agreement, it does not imply universal agreement. So consensus is a notion that deserves pause. It's not always well understood. Consensus, we have consensus when we have some number of people on board, and we have to declare what that number is. It has to be transparent to all members of the decision-making party. So, so much for radical democracy. Radical democracy is about bringing everyone to the table on par, regardless of rank or status, and making them part of decision-making. And decision-making here is not just decision-making, it's decision-making that leads to specific outcomes. They also talk about another principle, which I've never heard of, to be honest, under this title. That is to say, I've never heard this title before. Coopetition. Now, the interesting thing about coopetition, you can take a look at it, is it is an alternative approach to economics. It pictures an economic system in which people compete against shared challenges, right? Not against each other, against shared challenges. And these challenges, somehow, if we can accomplish them, we will add to human flourishing, right? We will accomplish outcomes that allow all of us to flourish. This is a radically different conception of economics. It's as far away from neoliberalism as you can get. I hesitate to slap a label on it. I think we should just leave it as it is. Co-opetition, it's difficult to describe. It would appear to imply common ownership and stewardship. So that's some form of communitarian ownership. It's not clear that that's social ownership. It's just not clear to me. Common ownership of land and stewardship, common stewardship of the land. Merging of capital and labor. These are ambitious goals, I might point out. Labor and capital have been at odds since 1750 and are still very much at odds. Lenders and borrowers should be brought together in co-opetition, so they're working to the same end. That's not impossible. None of this is impossible. There are various ways, I won't go into them here, but specific ways of merging the interests of lenders and borrowers. That's not impossible. Participative stewardship, I think, is implied by the very notion of integrative governance, because what are you integrating? You're integrating the views, the opinions, the positions of a wide range of individuals. In the case study, these would be farmers, right? Local farmers. So this entire farmer-to-farmer movement is under a different title, often called the food sovereignty movement. And it's considered a movement because it's so open, transparent, and non-hierarchical. So it's not a set of NGOs or governments. It's these networks and associations of farmers collaborating. They do a good job later in the chapter of articulating some of the challenges that this approach would face. Now, one last principle, what they call facilitative coordination. This is about coordinating network structures and bringing the different parts of the network, the governance network, into some kind of harmonious connection, right? So they mentioned promoters, facilitators, and coordinators. These are individuals, or in fact, roles. They're in effect roles within an integrative governance framework. Now, I wanted to read one section of it, but before I do that, let me make a final point. You can see, if you compare this approach to polycentric governance, I think you should be able to see a number of differences. First of all, the context is quite different, but the principles are different. We don't see, for example, here, any mention of feedback, of feedbacks and loops and those sorts of considerations that we saw in the case of resilience. Now, another thing I might say, and I'll conclude with this, I'll find the section I want to read, and I'll conclude with this statement. An awful lot of this, in my opinion, what we see here under integrative governance is an approach that's more aware of the challenges that we face in countering the threats that neoliberalism poses to human life. Whether we're talking about agriculture, whether we're talking about human health, whether we're talking about environmental sustainability, whether we're talking about the sustainability of human communities, it does not matter what we're talking about. This is an approach designed with that specific general context in mind, rather unlike polycentric governance as characterized in Principles for Building Resilience. That struck me as a more enclosed approach to environmental sustainability. We have ecosystems, we have social ecological systems, they interact, but the broader world of politics and economics and neoliberalism, hegemony, everything we've talked about that surrounds us does not surround polycentric governance as described in Principles. I mean, there's some of it, there's an acknowledgement of politics. But one of the things I critiqued the book for myself was its lack of political sophistication, its lack of political awareness. And I think this approach is more embedded in an appropriate vision of contemporary political, economic, and social challenges. So I would give it a bit of I would give it kudos for that, as opposed to what we see in Principles. Now, what I wanted to read, and I'll close with this, is at the very end, if I can find it, because I meant to call it up before. Just let me take a look. Where the hell is it? Thank you for holding on. Here it is. Radical community development demands a commitment to collective action for social, economic, and environmental justice. So there's a connection to justice right up front. Empowerment through critical consciousness, critical social theory, a clear understanding of societal power dynamics, not power dynamics within a governance system. We're talking about broader social realities, right? So, and the wider political context. So a clear understanding of societal power dynamics in the wider political context, and collective action at the root causes of injustice rather than its symptoms. The work must not only do good, it must be transformative. Radical community development must have participatory democracy at its heart and operate through an altered way of knowing the world in epistemology, and changed ways of being in the world, ontology. So you can see how deep this is, right? It seeks to develop a new epistemology, a new way of knowing that honors, by the way, indigenous knowledge, for example, and it aims to create a new ontological understanding of nature. And when we turn to our next topic, indigenous leadership, we will talk about that at some length. The issue at bottom is, how do we view nature to start with? You know, the neoliberal conception of nature sees it as a ground of exploitation, period. And indigenous approaches to nature are very, very different. We'll be talking about them soon. So just to finish the reading, or this section, it must seek to build connections between people that are based on values of respect, trust, mutuality, reciprocity, and dignity, which result in conviviality, compassion, and cooperation. Fine. These themes are woven through the chapters of the Handbook of Community Practice. This is what I want to say to close. This approach, integrated governance, I think is more suited to community development than the approach we saw in Principles. In fact, I'll be honest with you, when I read Principles for Building Resilience, I was not convinced that it is transformative in any way at all. It seems far more reformist in nature. That doesn't mean it's not worth doing. It just means that it might not be as worth doing as the kind of approach, the broader and more radical approach we see in this article. So with that said, I think I can conclude this discussion. I added this to our readings again, just so that we would have a different model in front of us, and a model that, moreover, is arguably more appropriate to community development writ large than what we saw in Principles. Principles is a text, by and large, if I'm not mistaken, to guide those who manage ecosystem services. And that's part of community development. I would never suggest otherwise, but it's a very specific domain. And this approach is much broader, and I think therefore more appropriate to transformation in the context of community development. So with that, I'll conclude, and thanks for your time. Bye. Wow.